You might think the Victorian era was all lace gloves, tea parties, and polite conversation. But beneath the tightly buttoned collars and moral sermons lay a world teeming with contradiction, repression, and secrets. This was a time when table legs were too scandalous to be seen. Women were diagnosed with hysteria and treated with early vibrators, and even the mention of sex could earn you a one-way ticket to social ruin. And yet, bravos thrived. Pornography circulated like contraband, and passion, while rarely spoken of, simmered behind every chaste gaze and gloved handshake. Welcome to the sexually repressed but absolutely fascinating Victorian era, a place where ignorance was mistaken for virtue, desire was a medical condition, and everyone was pretending not to be exactly what they were, human. Over the next 15 chapters, we'll lift the veil on the prudish facade and reveal the steamy, strange, and sometimes heartbreaking truths that history politely tried to cover up. So, tighten your corset, lower your voice, and step inside, because nothing is quite as prim and proper as it seems. The Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, wasn't just a time of technological advancement, imperial expansion, and dramatic fashion. It was also the golden age of sexual repression, where morality became a national obsession and modesty was worn like armor. Under the reign of Queen Victoria, Britain crafted a cultural myth, one of moral superiority, religious piety, and stoic self-control. But let's not be fooled. That myth was stitched together with more anxiety, contradiction, and hypocrisy than a Victorian's 14-piece wardrobe. At the heart of Victorian life was the ideal of moral purity. This wasn't just about avoiding scandal. It was about pretending scandal didn't even exist. Respectability became a kind of performance, and the stage was everywhere. In homes, in churches, in newspapers, even in furniture design. Conversations were sanitized, emotions were suppressed, and desire? That had no place in polite society. Victorian morality was especially rigid when it came to sex. It was a subject so taboo that even married couples often entered wedlock with only the vaguest understanding of what went on between the sheets. To speak of sex openly was to risk being seen as vulgar, dangerous, or worse, French. And nobody wanted to be accused of that kind of decadence. But where did this repression come from? Some of it was religious. Evangelical Christianity was on the rise, and it preached self-denial and restraint, particularly when it came to bodily pleasures. Then there was the fear of moral decay. The Industrial Revolution had thrust millions into crowded, chaotic urban centers. In this swirl of poverty, vice, and change, the upper classes clung tightly to traditional values, seeing them as the only thing standing between civilization and total collapse. Enter separate spheres ideology, the belief that men and women had distinct, divinely ordained roles. Men belonged in the public realm, business, politics, warfare. Women were the angels of the house, gentle, pure, submissive, and, crucially, sexually passive. This wasn't just a social belief. It was marketed as scientific fact. Phrenology, physiognomy, even early psychiatry all chipped in to prove that women were naturally modest and chaste, while men were naturally lustful but morally uplifted by female virtue. Of course, reality didn't quite line up with the fantasy. Victorians were human after all. Desires didn't just vanish because society said they should. Instead, they were driven underground. What couldn't be expressed in daylight came alive in secret, through coded love letters, under-the-table rendezvous, and entire underworlds of forbidden pleasure. The more society preached restraint, the more elaborate the escape hatches became. And make no mistake, these rules didn't apply equally. Middle and upper-class women were expected to be the paragons of virtue. But men, especially men of status, were given leeway.
They might sow their wild oats before marriage, or even maintain discreet affairs. Prostitution flourished during the Victorian era in part because it served as a societal pressure valve. Male desire was considered dangerous and uncontrollable. Better to let it out in secret than have it ruin a good marriage. Women, meanwhile, were told they shouldn't even have sexual feelings. If they did, something was clearly wrong with them. Some were diagnosed with hysteria, a mysterious condition conveniently attributed to female anatomy and repressed emotions. We'll get into that peculiar bit of medical history later. Essentially, any woman who strayed from the image of docile purity was labeled sick, sinful, or scandalous. Even the physical environment reflected this obsession with modesty. Homes were arranged to separate men and women. Language became euphemistic to the point of absurdity. A woman wasn't pregnant, she was in a delicate condition. Legs weren't legs, they were limbs, and often hidden behind frilly fabric on chairs and pianos. Because, heaven forbid, an exposed table leg might awaken unholy thoughts. All of this repression came with a price. It created a culture of silence, especially for women, where knowledge was discouraged, desire was feared, and the natural became shameful. But it also laid the groundwork for resistance. Some Victorians began to question the script. Writers, thinkers, even a few brave scientists started to push against the curtain. And behind the scenes, a more complicated human story unfolded. That's where we're going. In this series,
We'll pull back the velvet drapes of Victorian respectability to reveal what was really going on. Inside bedrooms, doctors' offices, dark alleys, and even the seance parlor. Because if the official story was all virtue and modesty, the unofficial one was much messier and infinitely more interesting. When you think of Victorian fashion, the image that probably springs to mind first is the corset, a tightly laced, bone-stiffened contraption designed to cinch the waist and lift the bosom into defiant, structured elegance. But the corset was more than just a fashion statement. It was a symbol, one that squeezed not only the body, but also the spirit, sexuality, and autonomy of women. The ideal Victorian woman was delicate, passive, and pure. The corset helped manufacture that image, quite literally. A properly laced corset compressed the rib cage, constricted breathing, and limited movement. It created a faint, fragile silhouette. Even fainting, yes, the infamous swoon, became fashionable, conveniently reinforcing the myth of feminine weakness. And wouldn't you know it, fainting couches were suddenly everywhere. But beyond the aesthetic, the corset served a deeper function, to control the female body. A woman who laced herself into a corset was not just shaping her figure, she was shaping her identity. She was conforming, quite literally, to a societal mold that demanded obedience, passivity, and above all, modesty. And don't be fooled by the romantic imagery. Corsets could be brutal. Whalebone stays, steel busks, laces drawn so tight they caused organ displacement and shallow breathing. Some women even had ribs surgically removed to maintain the coveted wasp waist figure. In an era where women were told their worth resided in virtue and appearance, the corset became both a badge of honor and a tool of oppression. It also had very complicated implications for sexuality. Victorian society clung to the idea that a woman's body was not her own. It belonged to her future husband, her children, or her social reputation. The corset reinforced this by physically locking the body away. It created a physical and psychological barrier between women and their own flesh. Touch was limited, movement was restricted, pleasure was minimized. You could look, but you couldn't access. It was chastity, worn like armor. Paradoxically, the corset was also incredibly eroticized, particularly by men. It was the very embodiment of repression and allure. The tightly laced waist and accentuated curves offered the illusion of control and submission while concealing the body just enough to tantalize.
In many ways, the corset became the perfect metaphor for the Victorian relationship with sex, tightly controlled on the surface, but seething with unspoken desire underneath. And let's not forget what corsets symbolized in medical discourse. Doctors, overwhelmingly male, often wrote about women's bodies as inherently weak and unstable. They warned that any form of physical exertion could damage a woman's delicate reproductive organs or disrupt her menstrual cycle, which they believed governed her sanity and morality. The corset, they argued, provided necessary support. It kept the womb in place, it corrected posture, it reinforced femininity. But behind these pseudoscientific justifications was a much simpler truth. The corset made women more compliant. If you can't breathe deeply, you can't run. If you can't bend easily, you can't climb. And if you're constantly faint from lack of oxygen, you're less likely to speak out, argue, or act with independence. The corset didn't just shape women, it restrained them. Not all women submitted, of course. By the late 19th century, dress reform movements began to challenge the tyranny of tight lacing. Activists like Amelia Bloomer and the Rational Dress Society advocated for looser clothing, healthier lifestyles, and the radical idea that women should be able to move freely. These early feminists recognized that you couldn't untangle the fight for sexual and social freedom from the literal strings that bound their bodies. Still, the corset reigned supreme throughout most of the Victorian period. It was worn daily by girls as young as 8 and removed only in the privacy of the bedroom, if at all. And even there, it wasn't always about liberation. Marital sex was often seen as a duty, not a pleasure, and many women were never taught enough about their own anatomy to know what liberation might even feel like.
So the corset stayed on, both literally and symbolically. It kept women in shape, but also in their place. It molded the body and the mind, reinforcing a society where sexual expression was stifled, desire was dangerous, and control was everything. In the end, the corset wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a philosophy, stitched into fabric and tied with a bow. And as we'll see in the next chapters, it was only one part of a much larger system built to repress and redirect human sexuality into carefully approved, suffocatingly narrow channels. Because in the Victorian world, to be a woman was to be tightly laced in every sense of the word. In today's world, dating might involve apps, texts, awkward first kisses, or swiping right. But in the Victorian era, romance was a carefully choreographed performance. Think fewer drinks at the bar, more supervised strolls in the garden. And God forbid you touch someone's hand, because that, dear viewer, could ignite a scandal. Victorian courtship was the art of falling in love without ever admitting you were attracted to someone. It was a world of coded glances, subtle fan movements, and painstakingly written letters that might take weeks to convey what a modern emoji could say in seconds. And yet, it was deadly serious business. One wrong move, a joke too suggestive, a skirt too short, a handshake too lingering, and your entire reputation could unravel. For women especially, the stakes were sky high. A Victorian lady's greatest asset was her virtue, a fragile and strictly policed concept that had little to do with morality and everything to do with appearances. To be seen as flirtatious or forward was enough to label her a fallen woman, and once a reputation fell, there was no getting it back, ever. Society rarely gave second chances, especially to women. That's why chaperones were essential. A young lady was almost never left alone with a man who wasn't her father, brother, or pastor. Want to have a simple conversation? Better hope Aunt Mildred's ears are sharp, because she's sitting 2 feet away with her knitting and her judgment. Even letters were often screened. Families would sometimes read the correspondence between courting individuals to ensure propriety. A little too much poetry, a hint of passion, or anything bordering on affection could be flagged as inappropriate. Expressing desire was simply not done, at least not openly.
And then there were the rules of engagement, not just metaphorically, but literally. A man had to formally declare his intentions before even beginning a courtship. And it wasn't some romantic surprise either. It involved careful negotiations between families, discussions of financial prospects, dowries, and social class. Romantic love? That was a lovely bonus if it happened, but it wasn't the priority. In fact, courtship was as much about social alignment as it was about affection. The goal wasn't just to find a partner, it was to find the right partner, meaning someone of suitable class, religion, and reputation. The Victorian obsession with order extended to relationships, where mismatches were not only frowned upon, they were sometimes outright scandalous. Now, let's talk about the strict gender roles that framed all of this. Men were expected to be the initiators, bold, rational, slightly lustful, but ultimately restrained by honor. Women were expected to be passive, emotional, modest, nurturing, and, most importantly, uninterested in sex. If a woman showed too much enthusiasm, she was indecent. If a man showed too little, he was weak or unmanly. Everyone had a role to play, and those who deviated faced consequences. This deeply ingrained system also dictated how people touched or didn't. A brush of the hand during a dance was charged with electricity. Eye contact held the weight of a confession. A handshake could be scandalous if held too long. Touch was rare and intentional, and as a result, loaded with meaning. Ironically, this hypersensitivity to physical contact often produced more titillation than outright freedom ever could. When you're told you can't do something, the desire to do it can become overwhelming. A stolen touch, a secret letter, a look across the ballroom. It wasn't just romance, it was rebellion.
It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Many Victorians truly believed in love, and for those lucky enough to find it within the rigid rules, courtship could be deeply romantic. There was something beautiful about the slowness, the anticipation, the idea of truly getting to know someone before rushing into physical intimacy. But for many others, the pressure to conform turned courtship into a gauntlet of fear and judgment, especially for women. And beneath the polite surface, many young people found ways to bend the rules. Lovers met in secret, letters were smuggled, parlor games got suspiciously flirtatious. Human beings have always found cracks in the system, and the Victorians, for all their restrictions, were no different. Still, society clung to its image of purity, even as reality chipped away at it. Relationships were supposed to be chaste and honorable, yet affairs, elopements, and scandals abounded. The very system designed to uphold morality was often the cause of its unraveling. In the end, Victorian courtship wasn't just about romance, it was about control. Control over women's bodies, over people's choices, over sexuality itself. It was a delicate dance performed on a tightrope of expectations, where one wrong step could send your social life plummeting. It sounds like a joke, a myth, something you'd hear at a party and scoff. No way that's real. But welcome to the Victorian era, where the modesty police didn't stop at hemlines and necklines. They went all the way to your furniture, specifically the legs of your piano. Yes, Victorian decor was so modest, even inanimate objects weren't safe from scrutiny. The idea was simple. If an object vaguely resembled a human body part, especially something as scandalously shapely as a leg, it needed to be concealed. Table legs, piano legs, even chair legs were often dressed in little frilly covers, like miniature trousers. Why? Because somewhere in the twitchy, pearl-clutching mind of Victorian decorum, a bare piano leg might awaken unspeakable urges. If that sounds absurd to you, congratulations, you are not living in a time when people thought ankles were X-rated. Now, to be fair, the whole piano leg anecdote is often exaggerated.
sometimes misattributed entirely to Victorian Americans and occasionally debunked by scholars who point out that not everyone covered their piano legs. But the fact that this myth has persisted for over a century says a lot about how repressive and ridiculous Victorian norms could be. And it's not just legend. There was an actual trend of modesty in furniture design. Home interiors were an extension of moral character, especially for women, who were judged as much by their parlor's propriety as their personal behavior. A scandalously styled ottoman or overly ornate leg could be seen as a reflection of loose morals. In a society that linked aesthetics with ethics, even home decor became a battleground for virtue. This obsession with propriety extended to language too. Words like leg and breast were considered impolite in mixed company, not because of their function, but because of their proximity to flesh. Instead of leg, one might say limb or extremity. Instead of pants, one said unmentionables. Even in medical literature, euphemism reigned supreme. Let's take a step back. What exactly was everyone so afraid of? In Victorian thought, sexuality, especially female sexuality, was a wild, dangerous force that had to be contained. If you so much hinted at it, you risked unleashing chaos. Every object, every gesture, every phrase had to be sanitized to prevent improper thoughts. This wasn't just about avoiding impropriety. It was about controlling imagination. If the eye could wander, the mind could wander, and if the mind wandered, who knows what might happen next? A rogue thought could lead to temptation, then to sin, and from there, total social collapse.
Sound extreme? It was. But the Victorians were obsessed with the belief that morality had to be upheld at all costs, even if that meant putting skirts on pianos. And of course, this prudishness wasn't equally enforced. Men could be cheeky in private. They had their clubs, their brothels, their copies of The Pearl, a wildly explicit underground magazine. Women, on the other hand, were expected to maintain a state of childlike ignorance well into adulthood. It wasn't just furniture being covered. It was knowledge, freedom, and desire. So the covered piano leg, whether literal or symbolic, represents something deeper. The Victorian terror of acknowledging the body. To admit the body existed was to admit it wanted something. And that, desire, was the ultimate threat. Better to lace it up, hide it behind lace, or drape it with heavy velvet than confront it honestly. Interestingly, this fetish for modesty sometimes backfired. The act of hiding things made them more mysterious and therefore more alluring. A forbidden glance at an ankle could stir more excitement than any exposed thigh. A whispered word could cause more fluster than an actual proposition. By trying to eliminate all traces of the sensual, Victorians inadvertently made the world more erotic. They infused everyday life with quiet, electric tension. It's hard not to laugh at it now, but it's also hard not to see how these ideas echo into the present. We still wrestle with the same anxieties: how much to show, what's appropriate, who gets to define morality. The piano leg may be covered in lace, but the issue still wide open. So next time someone tells you the Victorians were all serious and repressed, remember, these were people who dressed their furniture for decency. And that tells you everything you need to know about how far society will go to avoid a single uncomfortable truth. Humans have bodies, and those bodies come with curiosity, desire, and, yes, legs. If you lived in Victorian England and were a woman feeling anxious, sad, irritable, sexually frustrated, or simply alive, there's a good chance your doctor would diagnose you with hysteria. It was a catch-all term used to pathologize virtually anything a woman did that didn't conform to the ideal of passive, cheerful domesticity. Tired of housework? Hysteria. Crying too often? Hysteria. Expressing sexual desire? Definitely hysteria. This mysterious female malady was believed to stem from a wandering womb.
Yes, physicians literally thought the uterus could float around the body, causing mischief like a rogue balloon. The cure? Not empathy, not therapy, and certainly not an open discussion about sexual health. No, the standard treatment was something known as pelvic massage, a clinical procedure performed by male doctors that involved stimulating a woman's genitals until she reached what was described as a hysterical paroxysm. Let's be clear, that's an orgasm. But Victorian doctors would never call it that. In fact, they went to great lengths to avoid associating this treatment with anything sexual. It was medicine, they insisted, strictly professional. And women weren't supposed to have sexual pleasure anyway, so how could it be an orgasm if she didn't even know one was? The problem was, these treatments were time-consuming and exhausting. Doctors reported hand cramps. Some claimed it took hours to bring certain women to relief. Demand was high, patience was low. Something had to be done. Enter the vibrator. In the late 19th century, inventors developed the first electromechanical devices to assist doctors in performing pelvic massage. These early vibrators were large, clunky machines, closer to sewing machines than today's sleek designs, but they got the job done. Quicker, easier, and with far less hand strain. It was hailed as a medical breakthrough. Hospitals began installing them. Doctors advertised them in medical journals. And eventually, thanks to the rise of consumer culture, vibrators were marketed directly to women for home use, still under the guise of curing female problems like fatigue, nervousness, or irritability. This was arguably the most unintentionally progressive moment in Victorian sexual history. In trying to suppress and medicalize female sexuality, the Victorians accidentally gave women a tool to reclaim it.
And here's the kicker. The vibrator became one of the first electrical appliances available for domestic use, predating the vacuum cleaner and the electric iron. That's right. Long before anyone was sweeping carpets with a plug-in machine, women were zapping their hysteria away with a therapeutic buzz. But of course, as with all things Victorian, the cultural dissonance was enormous. On one hand, society refused to acknowledge that women had sexual needs. On the other, it created an entire industry to satisfy them, without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Eventually, the charade couldn't last. As 20th century media became more sexually explicit, the vibrator's association with pleasure became impossible to deny. It was quietly removed from medical catalogs and reclassified as a taboo object. What began as a doctor's tool became a bedroom secret. Still, the story of the vibrator reveals a lot about Victorian sexuality. The repression wasn't just personal, it was systemic, institutional, even commercial. Sexuality was denied not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real, too powerful. And in a culture obsessed with control, particularly control over women, that power had to be disguised as a dysfunction. This is the irony of the Victorian era. In trying to silence sexuality, it often amplified it. The more society pretended women didn't want sex, the more elaborate the systems became to explain away the evidence that they clearly did. And when desire couldn't be erased, it was pathologized. A woman's libido was not natural, it was a medical problem. But the truth buzzed just beneath the surface, literally. So the next time someone brings up the Victorians as the paragon of modesty, remind them, they invented the vibrator before the toaster. And not because they were open-minded, but because they were too repressed to call it what it really was. The Victorian era wasn't just about lace curtains and piano leg covers. It was also the age of empire. As Queen Victoria's Britain expanded its reach across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, it didn't just export goods, industry, and tea. It exported something else far more insidious: Victorian morality.
Missionaries, government officials, and civilized travelers spread the gospel of Christian decency, sexual restraint, and stiff upper lip etiquette to every corner of the globe. Native customs were dismissed as barbaric, local dress codes condemned as indecent, and indigenous sexual practices labeled as immoral. From India to Africa, the Victorian mission was clear: cleanse the colonies of their sensuality and bring them into the moral light of British virtue. But here's where it gets darkly ironic. While Victorians preached chastity and propriety abroad, many were privately indulging in the very desires they condemned. Take British men in colonial India. On the surface, they imposed strict laws against prostitution and lewd behavior. Behind closed doors, many frequented native brothels, took local mistresses, and kept household companions. Relationships that would have ruined them back home, but were quietly tolerated, even expected overseas. The colonies offered a kind of sexual loophole, a space where British men could behave in ways that Victorian society deemed unacceptable, but colonial society, conveniently distant and coded as exotic, allowed. Colonies became a stage for sexual double standards, where white men's desires were indulged and justified as natural male urges, while local women were exploited, objectified, and then blamed for tempting the invaders. This dynamic gave rise to a twisted narrative: the colonized woman as both victim and seductress. She was painted as exotic, hypersexual, morally inferior, ripe for conquest. Victorian literature and art reflected this fantasy. Think of the Arabian Nights, or Orientalist paintings filled with dusky-skinned women lounging half-naked on silk cushions. These weren't just stories, they were projections of British desire, masked as moral concern. In this colonial gaze, sexuality was something that happened to other people, not proper British wives and daughters, but the nameless, racialized figures of empire. The colonized body became a canvas on which Victorians projected their fears, fantasies, and
frustrations. It wasn't just about domination, it was about displacement. If desire couldn't be admitted at home, it could at least be outsourced. And let's not forget the missionary wives. These women were sent across oceans to bring Christian virtue to the so-called heathens, but often found themselves isolated, miserable, and caught between Victorian expectations and harsh colonial realities. Their letters home are filled with coded language, moral challenges, difficult customs, and temptations of the climate, all subtle references to the sexual undercurrents they couldn't name but couldn't escape. Colonialism also created new categories of people who lived in sexual limbo. Mixed-race children, for instance, were both living proof of British men's hypocrisy and a social problem to be erased. These children were often denied status, rights, or recognition. After all, what moral empire could admit that its rulers fathered children they refused to acknowledge? Meanwhile, back in Britain, the official narrative remained sanitized. The empire was a place of discipline, not desire. Colonies were for civilization, not seduction. Any stories that broke the illusion were either suppressed or twisted into morality tales about the dangers of unchecked passion. The hypocrisy was almost too neat, but it wasn't just men indulging abroad. Women, too, occasionally found more freedom in the colonies than they did at home. Away from prying eyes, some were able to shed the tight corset of British expectations. Relationships, same-sex bonds, and flirtations that would have scandalized London sometimes passed under the radar in distant outposts. Desire didn't disappear under empire. It simply found new costumes. And so, the Victorian Empire was a paradox, a global machine built on control, yet riddled with contradiction. It claimed to civilize the world while simultaneously exploiting its people for labor, land, and lust. It preached purity at home while practicing indulgence abroad. In exporting Victorian morality, the empire didn't erase desire, it displaced it. What couldn't be spoken in English drawing rooms was acted out in colonial bedrooms. And when the dust settled, the empire left behind more than railways and red postboxes. It left a legacy of sexual confusion, racial exploitation, and moral denial that still echoes today. If the Victorian era was the golden age of repression, it was also, paradoxically, a golden age of secret obsession, especially when it came to erotica and pornography. Publicly, the Victorians were horrified by any open acknowledgement of sex, but privately, they were devouring it. Underneath all that prudish lace and moral posturing, there existed a thriving underground world of smut, sensual literature, erotic photography, and clandestine illustrations. It was hidden behind locked drawers, traded in back alleys, and printed under fake names. But make no mistake, it was everywhere. Let's start with literature. While Jane Austen's polite romantic glances filled the shelves of respectable households, a parallel market bloomed for books that couldn't be mentioned in polite company. Titles like The Pearl, My Secret Life, and The Lustful Turk were passed around in hushed tones. These works were often crude, wildly explicit, and entirely at odds with the image of Victorian restraint. Take My Secret Life, a pornographic memoir that spans over 1 million words and chronicles the exploits of an anonymous English gentleman. It's a shocking, unfiltered glimpse into the sexual world of the Victorian elite, filled with seductions, prostitutes, housemaids, and countless encounters the author describes with zero shame and maximum detail. And that wasn't an anomaly. The Pearl, a monthly erotic magazine published in the late 1870s, featured sexually explicit stories, poems, and even naughty limericks. It was smut in the finest Victorian fashion, crafted with such literary flair that it blurred the line between art and filth. Readers were titillated not just by the sex, but by the thrill of transgression. Reading such things was an act of rebellion against the moral order, against gender expectations, against repression itself. But it wasn't just the written word. Erotic photography was all the rage. As cameras became more accessible in the mid-19th century, so too did nude portraiture, though not the kind hanging in art museums. Victorian erotic photographs were often carefully staged, with models posed in settings meant to mimic respectable environments. Draped over divans, peeking through lace curtains, sometimes even dressed partially in corsets or gloves, as if undressing for the viewer. Of course, these photos were illegal. The 1857 Obscene Publications Act made it a criminal offense to distribute or possess materials considered to deprave and corrupt. But enforcement was inconsistent, and demand was insatiable. As long as there were locked rooms, false-bottom trunks, and complicit printers, the trade thrived. And let's not forget the erotic art, especially the highly detailed illustrations that blended classical themes with shockingly explicit imagery. Many pieces were styled after Greek or Roman mythology to give a veneer of respectability. After all, if it was about Zeus and nymphs, it wasn't pornography, it was culture. Even the medical world got in on the act. Anatomical textbooks were often studied with more than scholarly curiosity, and many illustrations walked the fine line between science and softcore. And remember the treatment for hysteria we discussed earlier? Well, a few of those medical manuals included visual guides that left very little to the imagination. So, how did Victorians reconcile this double life? This society that publicly scorned sex while privately consuming it with ravenous appetite? They didn't. Instead, they constructed a world of coded behavior. You could enjoy erotica as long as you condemned it in public. You could collect nude photographs as long as you called them art studies. You could read The Lustful Turk as long as you pretended it was an exotic cautionary tale. Hypocrisy wasn't just a side effect of repression, it was essential to it. And the deeper the repression, the more powerful the obsession became. Erotica offered escape. It was a way to reclaim the body, to explore desire, to experience emotions the culture had forbidden. The very things society labeled obscene were in fact deeply human, and that made them impossible to truly suppress. In many ways, Victorian pornography wasn't just about sex, it was about freedom. A secret revolt against a world that said your desires were shameful. A quiet, printed, photographed rebellion. To the Victorian mind, marriage was supposed to be the sanctuary of decency, a holy union, a moral contract, and most importantly, the only acceptable setting for sexual activity. But don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't the honeymoon suite. For many Victorians, sex within marriage was less about passion and more about duty. Specifically, a woman's duty to her husband and to queen and country. The prevailing belief was that men had sexual needs and women did not, or at least they weren't supposed to. Wives were expected to submit to their husband's desires, not because they enjoyed it, but because it was their role. Marriage was often framed as a contract in which a woman's body was handed over in service to the man's virtue and to the production of children. This idea was reinforced by religion, science, and society. Religious leaders preached that a good Christian wife should never refuse her husband, lest she tempt him toward immoral behavior. Early medical texts warned that overindulgence in sex, especially initiated by women, could lead to hysteria, infertility, or even death. Yes, they thought women could die from wanting sex too much. The horror. For middle and upper class women, modesty was the ultimate virtue. A good wife never talked about sex, never admitted to enjoying it, and certainly never initiated it. If she did, she risked being labeled immoral, unfeminine, or even insane. The ideal Victorian woman was chaste before marriage, passive during it, and saintly after. Any sign of sexual agency was suspect. In fact, some Victorian advice books recommended that brides go into their wedding night completely unaware of what was about to happen. Mothers often refused to explain, fearing the truth would frighten or corrupt their daughters. The result? Generations of young women entering marriage with zero knowledge of sex, often experiencing their first encounter as confusing, painful, or traumatic.
For men, it was another story. Husbands were often expected to teach their wives, but many had already been educated through brothels, mistresses, or erotica. This created a disturbing double standard. Husbands were supposed to be experienced, while wives were expected to be innocent, and yet somehow they were supposed to function together in harmony. Spoiler, they often didn't. And it wasn't just about sex. Even talking about sex in marriage was taboo. If a woman had questions, curiosities, or problems, she had nowhere to turn. Doctors treated female sexuality as a mystery, if not a problem. Therapists, as we know them today, didn't exist, and the idea of discussing sexual dissatisfaction was scandalous. This silence bred a culture of confusion, guilt, and repression, especially for women who did feel desire. Many suffered quietly, convinced that something was wrong with them. Others confessed to doctors or clergy only to be diagnosed with hysteria or worse. The idea that a wife might want sex for her own pleasure was simply outside the Victorian imagination. Yet, despite all this moral posturing, sex within marriage still happened. And when it did, it wasn't always miserable. Some couples did manage to connect, to love, even to enjoy physical intimacy. But they were navigating a minefield of expectations. Every kiss, every touch, every night shared was filtered through layers of shame, duty, and silence. Birth control? Practically non-existent, at least officially. Contraception was frowned upon and sometimes criminalized, thanks in part to laws like the Obscene Publications Act. Discussions of condoms or withdrawal methods were often buried in euphemisms. Some women used abstinence. Others relied on guesswork. Many simply had child after child because pregnancy was seen as both natural and unavoidable. And then there were the men who strayed. While wives were expected to be faithful, it was somewhat understood that husbands might seek satisfaction elsewhere. Victorian society looked the other way, as long as it didn't make headlines. This hypocrisy was so deeply ingrained, it barely even registered. But in the private realm of marriage, the toll was real. Repressed desire, emotional distance, silent suffering. For many Victorian couples, the bedroom wasn't a refuge, it was a battlefield. And yet, this strict system couldn't last forever. Cracks were forming, whispers were spreading. Some women were beginning to question the rules. Some men were admitting dissatisfaction. Slowly, quietly, rebellion was brewing. The Victorian era is often remembered for its rigid moral codes, especially about sex and gender. But beneath the surface of corseted conformity, there was a hidden world where same-sex love and gender nonconformity quietly existed, sometimes celebrated, often persecuted. Victorian society was built on clear lines. Men acted like men, women acted like women, and anything outside those bounds was considered a threat to the social order. Same-sex relationships were criminalized and stigmatized. The infamous Labouchere Amendment of 1885 made gross indecency between men punishable by prison, a law that would later doom Oscar Wilde. But these harsh laws didn't erase desire. Instead, they pushed it underground. Secret clubs, coded language, and private meetings became lifelines for those who loved outside the norm. Male couples met discreetly in parks, gentlemen's clubs, or private homes. Women formed romantic friendships, sometimes openly affectionate relationships that could blur the line between friendship and love without necessarily attracting suspicion. Yet, it wasn't just about hiding. Some Victorians were starting to question what it meant to be a man or a woman. Gender nonconformity, wearing clothing, adopting mannerisms, or expressing identities outside one's assigned sex was often pathologized, but also present in art, literature, and everyday life. Some transgender and non-binary individuals found ways to live authentically, though often at great personal risk. Figures like Radcliffe Hall, though slightly post-Victorian, drew from this era's shadows. And early sexologists like Havelock Ellis and Magnus Hirschfeld began to study sexuality scientifically, arguing that same-sex desire was natural and not a moral failing. Their work planted seeds that would later grow into modern LGBTQ rights. Despite persecution, this underground culture influenced art, fashion, and literature, providing coded symbols and stories of love and identity that survived generations. It reminds us that Victorian repression never truly silenced human diversity. By the late 19th century, the seemingly impenetrable Victorian moral code began showing signs of cracks. What had once seemed like a uniform culture of repression slowly gave way to voices calling for sexual freedom, education, and reform. One of the earliest sparks was the rational dress movement, which challenged constricting clothing, corsets, and heavy layers that symbolized female repression. Women argued that restrictive fashion not only harmed physical health, but also limited emotional and sexual expression. This movement wasn't just about clothes, it was about demanding autonomy over one's body. Simultaneously, early feminist activists began questioning the role of women in society, including their sexual rights. Thinkers like Josephine Butler campaigned against the sexual double standard, calling for fair laws on prostitution and advocating that women had the right to control their own bodies and desires. The publication of Havelock Ellis's studies on human sexuality was revolutionary. He argued that sexual variation was normal, that women had sexual desires just like men, and that repression caused more harm than good. His work helped destigmatize topics like masturbation, homosexuality, and women's sexual pleasure,
ideas radical for the time. Meanwhile, contraceptive advocacy started taking root. Activists like Margaret Sanger, though later and more American, drew inspiration from Victorian pioneers who tried to provide women with information and tools to prevent unwanted pregnancies. This was a direct challenge to laws that treated birth control as obscene. Popular culture also shifted. The arts began exploring sexuality more openly, and literature, theater, and visual media gradually peeled back layers of prudery. While still heavily censored, underground publications flourished and public debates on sexuality grew louder. However, resistance remained fierce. Religious conservatives, politicians, and even some medical professionals doubled down on repression, warning that loosening sexual morals would lead to societal collapse. Despite the pushback, these movements laid the groundwork for the sexual revolutions of the 20th century. The Victorian era's repressive shell was cracking, and behind it, new possibilities for understanding and expressing human sexuality were emerging. Victorians treasured the idea of childhood innocence like a sacred treasure, something pure and fragile that must be protected at all costs. This belief shaped how children were raised, educated, and shielded from anything remotely related to sex or the body. But in protecting this innocence, they often fostered ignorance, and with it, confusion, fear, and shame. Sexual education, as we understand it today, was essentially non-existent. Most children, especially girls, received little to no factual information about their bodies, reproduction, or sexuality. Parents, teachers, and clergy either avoided the topic altogether or cloaked it in euphemisms and warnings. Conversations about the birds and the bees were more likely to be replaced by vague references to moral lessons, purity, and the dangers of temptation. Many families believed that talking about sex would corrupt children's innocence or tempt them into premature sexual activity. So instead, children were taught to fear their own bodies and desires. Puberty was seen as a dangerous, mysterious time, something to survive rather than understand. This lack of education had real consequences. Many young people entered adolescence confused and unprepared. Girls often didn't understand menstruation until it happened, sometimes without warning. Boys were left to figure out their bodies in isolation, sometimes turning to masturbation, which was itself labeled a dangerous vice. Masturbation was a particular obsession of Victorian moralists and doctors who believed it caused everything from insanity to physical deformities. In some cases, extreme measures were taken to prevent it, ranging from chastity belts to painful surgical interventions. This fear of self-pleasure symbolized the broader anxiety about sexuality in all its forms. Schools largely avoided sex education, focusing instead on religious and moral instruction. The prevailing message was clear: children must learn self-control, modesty, and obedience. Any curiosity was discouraged, and questions about sex were met with embarrassment or punishment. Yet, despite the repression, some Victorian children found ways to learn. Folk tales, whispered conversations, and illicit books passed from hand to hand. Older siblings, servants, and even street vendors sometimes provided information, albeit often inaccurate and sensationalized.
The Victorian obsession with protecting innocence paradoxically created a culture of secrecy and shame that haunted children well into adulthood. Adults who had grown up in ignorance were often ill-equipped to discuss sex with their own children, perpetuating the cycle. Still, by the late Victorian period, the earliest attempts at sexual education began to emerge. Some reformers advocated for more honest, scientific teaching about the body and reproduction, arguing that knowledge would empower young people to make better choices and resist temptation. These pioneers faced enormous resistance, but their efforts planted the seeds for modern sex education, an acknowledgement that ignorance is not innocence and that understanding one's body is essential to health and happiness. In the world of Victorian England, the figure of the fallen woman loomed large, a symbol of both moral panic and social hypocrisy.
Prostitution was one of the era's most glaring contradictions, officially condemned as sin and social decay, yet tolerated and even tacitly supported by many powerful men. Victorians publicly vilified prostitutes as dangerous, immoral women who threatened the purity of society. The ideal Victorian woman was chaste, modest, and devoted to home and family. Prostitutes, by contrast, were seen as corrupt, desperate, and irredeemable. Yet, prostitution flourished, driven by poverty, lack of opportunities for women, and a society that rigidly restricted female independence. Economic realities forced many women into sex work. With few legal rights and limited employment options, prostitution was often the last resort to survive. Industrial cities booming with wealth and commerce created a high demand for sexual services, especially among working-class and middle-class men. The Victorian middle and upper classes often turned a blind eye to prostitution. Men, married or single, frequently used prostitutes discreetly. Gentlemen's clubs, pubs, and brothels became places where the strict social rules of the daytime were suspended. This hidden patronage highlighted a deep hypocrisy. Men upheld public morality while privately indulging in the very behavior they condemned. Efforts to control prostitution led to complicated laws, such as the Contagious Diseases Acts 1864 to 1886, which allowed police to detain and forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution to control venereal diseases. These laws targeted women exclusively and were criticized for violating civil liberties. Campaigners like Josephine Butler fought tirelessly against them, arguing that they punished women for a problem caused largely by men. The fallen woman narrative also permeated Victorian literature and art, portraying prostitutes as tragic figures doomed by their sins, yet deserving pity. Novels like Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Charles Dickens's works often depicted women caught in cruel social traps, exposing the harsh realities behind the moralizing rhetoric. At the same time, some women sought redemption through charity work and reform movements. Magdalene asylums and rescue homes promised salvation, but conditions were often harsh, emphasizing repentance over empowerment. The message was clear: fallen women must be saved and controlled. This complex interplay of condemnation, hypocrisy, and occasional compassion shows how Victorian society struggled to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The repression of sexuality didn't eliminate desire, it simply pushed it into darker, more dangerous places. Despite the era's public prudery and censorship, Victorian literature and media were rife with secrets, scandals, and coded explorations of sex. Writers, playwrights, and publishers had to navigate a complex labyrinth of laws and social expectations, often resorting to innuendo, allegory, or outright subversion to discuss sexual themes. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 made it illegal to publish material that could deprave and corrupt readers. This law led to numerous prosecutions, book bannings, and underground circulation of banned texts. Yet, it also sparked a fascinating cultural game: how to write about sex without saying the word sex. Victorian novels often contained double meanings. Sensual encounters were described through nature metaphors, flowers, storms, or animal imagery that hinted at desire without explicit language. This allowed readers to interpret passages on multiple levels: a chaste surface for the cautious and a more provocative undercurrent for the initiated.
Take Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which explores themes of sexual violence, loss of innocence, and social judgment. Hardy's portrayal of Tess challenged Victorian ideals, eliciting both praise and outrage. The novel was a bold critique of society's harsh treatment of women, wrapped in poetic but painfully real storytelling. Playwrights like Oscar Wilde used wit, satire, and coded dialogue to explore themes of sexuality and identity. Wilde's own scandal and imprisonment for gross indecency revealed just how dangerous it was to challenge sexual norms openly. His plays, full of sparkling repartee, often danced around forbidden topics with clever ambiguity. Meanwhile, sensationalist newspapers and magazines thrived on scandals involving sex, divorce, and infidelity. Victorian readers craved gossip about high-profile cases, especially those involving the aristocracy. These stories revealed the deep cracks in the polished facade of respectability. The rise of photography also complicated matters. Nude photographs and risque portraits circulated secretly, blurring lines between art and obscenity. Photographic albums were treasured possessions hidden from prying eyes. Even scientific texts on sex, like the pioneering work of Havelock Ellis, struggled with censorship. Ellis's frank discussions of masturbation, homosexuality, and female desire were groundbreaking but met with hostility. This tension between repression and expression created a culture obsessed with sex but terrified of it. Writers and artists used their craft to expose the hypocrisy, illuminate hidden desires, and sometimes to rebel. As the Victorian era waned, these literary and media secrets helped pave the way for more open conversations about sexuality in the 20th century. The Victorian era may feel like a distant, dusty chapter in history, but its impact on modern attitudes towards sex and sexuality is profound and lasting. The tight web of repression, secrecy, and moral judgment woven during this period left deep imprints that continue to influence our culture, laws, and personal lives today. Victorian sexual norms created a template of shame and silence around sex that persisted well into the 20th century. Many of the ideas about modesty, chastity, and sexual properness became deeply embedded in Western culture. These cultural codes shaped everything from sex education, gender roles, to marriage expectations, and even mental health stigma. For decades after the Victorian era, society struggled to shake off the sense that sex was something dirty or dangerous, something to be controlled rather than celebrated. This legacy contributed to the rise of taboos around discussing sex openly, which slowed the progress of sexual liberation movements and education. Yet, Victorian repression also sparked counter-movements that fueled later breakthroughs. The early feminist and sexual reform activists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries built directly on the cracks that appeared in Victorian morality. Their efforts to fight censorship, promote birth control, and challenge gender norms were radical steps toward the sexual freedoms many enjoy today. In literature, art, and science, the Victorian struggle with sex pushed creators and thinkers to develop more nuanced understandings of human desire, identity, and pleasure. The scientific studies of sex pioneered during this era laid groundwork for modern sexology, psychology, and LGBTQ advocacy. Even today, we see echoes of Victorian sexual repression in ongoing debates about sexual education, women's reproductive rights, and the stigmatization of LGBTQ identities. The tension between prudishness and liberation remains a cultural tug-of-war. But there's hope, too. By understanding how Victorian repression shaped our past, we gain tools to question outdated norms and build more open, honest, and healthy attitudes towards sex and relationships. The story of Victorian sexuality is not just a tale of darkness, it's also a story of resilience, rebellion, and the slow but steady march toward freedom.
As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowy world of Victorian sexual repression, it's time to reflect on the lessons this era offers us today. The story of the Victorian sexual landscape is one of extremes, from strict moral codes and silencing taboos to quiet rebellions and the birth of modern sexual consciousness. First, the Victorians teach us the danger of repression. By forcing natural human desires underground, through shame, ignorance, and fear, they created more harm than good. The widespread silence about sex led to confusion, mental health struggles, and a distorted understanding of pleasure and consent. It shows that repression doesn't erase desire, it only intensifies secrecy and suffering. Second, the era reveals the power of societal expectations in shaping personal behavior. The strict gender roles and sexual double standards impose limits on individuals' freedoms, especially for women and sexual minorities. Recognizing these pressures helps us understand why some struggles persist today and why challenging cultural norms is so important. Third, the Victorian period reminds us of the importance of education and openness. The gradual emergence of sex education, scientific study of sexuality, and early activism all point toward the need for honest conversations about sex without shame or judgment. When people are informed, they can make healthier choices and build more respectful relationships. Fourth, this history highlights the value of empathy and inclusion. Hidden beneath Victorian repression was a diverse range of human experiences: same-sex love, gender nonconformity, desire for autonomy that were misunderstood or punished. Today, embracing this diversity enriches society and promotes well-being. Finally, the story encourages us to continue the work of breaking down taboos and promoting sexual health and freedom. While the world has changed drastically since Victorian times, many cultural remnants of repression remain. By learning from the past, we can foster a culture where sexuality is treated as a natural, positive part of life. In sum, the Victorian era's tangled legacy is a cautionary tale, but also a foundation for progress. Its lessons inspire us to build a future where sexuality is not feared or shamed, but understood, respected, and celebrated. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Victorian sexual life. If there's one takeaway, it's this: history matters, not just for what happened, but for what it teaches us about being human.